I don't know, I'm worried it's not long enough.
Well, how long is it?
4, if you're being generous.
I'm never generous.
2.5 then. But it's so well crafted.
Objection! Relevancy?
This is therapy.
Exactly. So, you'll listen to me.
Do you always have people over when you're having a session?
Oh, no, just my client.
If you could have your foreskin back, would you? Would you, if there's a process to surgically reattach it, would you?
Yes, I feel like a part of me is nice.
Fair. Huh.
I'm at a point right now where my backlog feels entirely untamable. In an era of open world games filled with bloat, endless side quests, and activities to complete, all on top of stories that span dozens and dozens of hours, it could be really refreshing to finish a game in just a handful of sittings. For me especially, playing through a tightly crafted linear narrative experience is a great change of pace. Of course, I still do enjoy longer games, I just have a hard time finishing them, or even starting in the first place because I know I won't finish. In this first video of a 3-part series, I'll talk about why I like short games, and in the future I'll talk more about why I have so much trouble getting into longer games, and then I'll talk about the games that, despite all of that, still suck me in for a long time. I think short games are incredibly valuable, though large games are also great. The point of this video isn't to say short games are better than long games, but rather to highlight aspects of shorter games and experiences that might be overlooked, or simply underappreciated in a time where many major game developers are striving for bigger worlds and never-ending live service experiences.
No.
Yeah, that happens.
At the end of the day, it's always going to be a matter of taste and individual circumstances. For me, right now, these shorter games are more rewarding because I can jump around between wildly different experiences at a fast pace while still getting the satisfaction of beating the games and carving out a dent in the grand sea of my backlog. An intricately crafted story is probably the most obvious strength afforded by a game's shorter length. Because shorter games usually feature less side activities, the main flow of the game isn't interrupted very much, and the more linear the game, the more control developers have over the way in which players experience the game. Take The Last of Us, for instance, or even the Uncharted games. The player usually has some freedom to explore and find collectibles, resources, or other small secrets, but ultimately, the player is guided along a predestined path towards the next story beat. The player has very little opportunity to get lost or super distracted from their main objective. This means that the pace of the game is very similar for all players, with the largest discrepancy being how long players break between play sessions. This control over pace means that devs also have more control over narrative impact. A deeply emotional scene, perhaps involving the loss of a cherished character, may not hit the player properly if the build-up isn't done right. In a linear experience, the devs know exactly where the player has been recently and can shape the scene for maximum impact. In an open world game, like, say, Breath of the Wild, the player could have been doing any number of things before stumbling upon the next story beat, often leading to some pretty bad tonal whiplash. Breath of the Wild is kind of a worst-case scenario for narrative control in an open-world game, though that is by design, it still means the narrative isn't as strong as something that was intricately tuned by the storytellers. You might be able to tell that I enjoy linear experiences, but I also enjoy games that are really open-ended. While less common, these kinds of experiences can be found in shorter games. One of my favorite games from 2019, A Short Hike, is exactly what it says on the tin. Short. About an hour and a half short, actually. But it doesn't hold your hand or guide you, it simply drops you into a tiny world and lets you run free. It gives you a freedom of feeling and wanderlust that isn't overwhelming, but nothing you do feels tedious. It doesn't have a huge focus on narrative, though there is a pleasant little story here. The main course is simply exploring the island and giving you an hour or two to get lost in a meditative state of self-reflection. Or at least, that's what I got out of it. Simple but unique gameplay concepts are also given a chance to thrive in shorter experiences. A long game has to ensure that its mechanics are engaging enough to sustain dozens upon dozens of hours of playtime. For a game like Xenoblade Chronicles 2, this means the combat gets really complex. One big trend right now is skill trees, as a way of extending the longevity of core combat mechanics. When done right, skill trees drip feed the player new abilities, both gradually changing combat and giving the player new goals to strive for. When done poorly, the trees lock trivial and pointless upgrades behind insignificant progression, and do little to change the actual gameplay experience and simply act as a way of complicating the level up process. Shorter games don't have to worry as much about the long-term sustainability of their mechanics, nor do they have to superficially elongate their lifespan with cheap progression gates. Pokemon Snap has a very unique gameplay loop. Taking pictures of Pokemon is probably not a mechanic that could support a 35+ hour adventure, and would probably become boring or draining. Though, at the short lengths of both of the games, the core experience never drags its feet or overstays its welcome. The game keeps up a brisk pace and shows you new things frequently until the credits roll. But there's plenty to do if you want to keep playing past the initial runtime. LEGO Builder's Journey, a game I finally got around to this summer, is not terribly complex. It's a pretty by-the-numbers puzzle game where you need to build a path to connect your character to its destination with the available LEGO pieces. It clocks in at maybe 2 hours, but I adored it. And the simplicity of its mechanics mean that it's ill-suited for a long game, but it's perfect for a beautifully refined game that's meant to be beaten in a sitting or two. Likewise, visual novels or walking simulators are other genres that don't often exist as super long games, and prove quite controversial when they do. Firewatch doesn't have much gameplay per se, so if it was anything but a short experience, it would probably be more effort than it was worth. In Death Stranding's case, I think the game's grueling runtime of 40 hours actually makes the payoff incredible and the whole experience work, but it's not for everyone, and I have a lot to say on that topic, so I'll save it for another time. Action games in particular often have relatively short runtimes, and are better for it. A shorter length means new ability unlocks or new mechanics can be paced so the game never stagnates or feels bloated. Action games are also designed to encourage score chasing and replayability, so players who want to continue past the short run of the initial game have plenty to do, but players who are satisfied by bringing the story to a close won't be missing out if they've had their fill. In the same vein, games like single-player shooters or racing games tend to run on the short side. The simplicity of pointing and shooting is a simultaneously infinitely repeatable mechanic, and one that can rapidly become stale if in the wrong environment. Multiplayer shooters are popular because of the application of the simple mechanic of pointing and shooting to an ever-changing field of competition. Fighting real-life opponents is a game that never gets old, because people are always learning new strategies, the meta is always changing, and the simple mechanics lend themselves well to delicate perfection and mastery. But a single-player shooter campaign rarely exceeds 10 to 15 hours because developers can only realistically include so many scenarios before the player gets bored of designed combat and predictable AI. Level design also benefits from a smaller project scale. A consistent level of quality is much easier to maintain in a 6-hour handcrafted experience in a 60-hour computer-generated landscape. Titanfall 2 comes to mind with excellent parkour sections seamlessly blending in and out of frantic combat. The Portal games run at a perfect pace with consistently solid puzzle design that might have faltered if the game stretched on too long. Celeste features some of the most well-designed, tightest platforming I've ever played. Creating games of this quality is expensive and time-consuming, so it makes sense that they would be shorter in length. Another interesting talking point is project budget. This isn't necessarily a pro or a con, but it's just interesting to look at between studio sizes. Shorter games are more feasible for indie studios to create and make well because they require less resources. However, that doesn't always mean shorter games use less resources. To briefly mention The Last of Us Part 2, the game had a lot of available budget, being one of Sony's most popular IPs developed by one of their most popular studios, and you can see that budget in the graphics and animation. So with bigger studios, a shorter game often means an impressive technical showcase. This of course does come at the trade-off of having less content than if that budget were used to create a vast open world game. But like I said at the beginning, I don't think that's a bad thing, or a good thing. It just comes down to player taste. The whole argument that content equals value that is running through the industry right now is becoming incredibly tiresome. In the marketing lead up to Dying Light 2's release, they announced via Twitter that the game had roughly 500 hours of content. I've yet to play it, but based on public reception and the lack of conversation about the game after its first week or two, I'd wager that very little of that content is super compelling. I'm sure it's still a good game, but I doubt that most of that content feels meaningful to the player or worthwhile. Companies right now are focusing on creating games that players will never put down, and on the surface, that sounds nice. I'd love to spend more time with the games I enjoy, but right now it's coming at the price of being a game I enjoy. A lot of these massive open world experiences overwhelm me with cluttered maps, checklists of chores to complete, and endless filler. After a point, it feels less like playing a game and more like crossing off a to-do list, but most of the things that you have to do reward you very little and end up being largely unsatisfying. If you enjoy that kind of experience, more power to you, but at the moment, it's become fairly draining for me. The bottom line is that shorter games afford the opportunity for a cohesive and consistent experience relative to both gameplay and narrative. Gameplay that couldn't support long playtimes is given a chance to thrive, and gripping stories are allowed to sit at the front and center of an experience. Developers are able to finely tune a smaller collection of components, thus allowing them to design a more consistently high-quality game. Of course, a game being short does not mean it will be good. Everything I've talked about are opportunities afforded by a smaller scale project. It's also worth noting that these things can also happen in massive games, like Red Dead 2. And again, I'm not saying that short games are better than long games. I'm simply appreciating some of the benefits of them and why I like to play them.
So what you're saying is that size doesn't matter?
No. It's all about how you use the size you have.
What if I don't use it?
Well, then you probably won't sell a lot.
Oh, I'm not in the market to sell.
Then what?
Oh, I'm just curious for my personal life.
Are we talking about the same thing here?
You told me. Take a look at my notes.
Did you draw 37 pictures of male genitalia with varying lengths?
How did you count them so fast?
It says in your header. Anyways, I was talking about video games. Were you even listening?
Oh! I thought you were talking about dick.
I'm just worried it's too long.
Mm-hmm.